Good afternoon. My name is Dina Temple-Raston, and I'm the counterterrorism correspondent for National Public Radio. I hope you had a nice lunch. And our panel today is sort of the crystal ball panel. We've been asked to look into the future and to identify threats coming down the road and what we could do as a country to prevent them. Among other things, we're going to take a look at whether or not terrorism will continue to be a first-order concern or whether it'll return to more of where it was before 9/11, and whether it will just become something that we keep an eye on while we focus on other things. So let me start by introducing our panel. We have fixtures of the intelligence community across the board. Matt Burrows and I decided not to wear a blue blazer just to shake things up a little bit. Mathew Burrows is counselor at the National Intelligence Council, known as the NIC. It put out a very interesting report that I recommend to you called Global Trends 2030, which we'll be discussing a little bit more in a minute. It provides some fodder for those of you who are wondering about threats in the future. What we don't cover here, you might be able to see in the report. Sitting next to him is John McLaughlin, the former acting and deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he's now at Johns Hopkins. Sitting to his, let's see, that's my left hand, his left is Charles Allen. I think most of you know him. He was the former Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Intelligence and Analysis, and a fixture, as I said, in the intelligence community. I've talked to him many times over the years, and he's now at the Chertoff group. And last but not at all least is Maurice Sonnenberg, and he's the co-chairman of the National Commission for the Review of Research and Development Programs of the U.S. Intelligence Committee. So we've got people who are well qualified to discuss this. So Matt, I thought we'd start with you. In the NIC's Global Trends 2030, one of the themes was about individual empowerment. It was seen as a largely positive force that is helping foster political and economic improvements around the world. But the paper also makes the point that the growing individual empowerment opens up a Pandora's box of new and heightened security threats. Could you lay out that argument for us, please?
Yeah, this work is an effort to really look out 15, 20 years in the future, and it's used as a planning document. So it's not trying to predict exactly what is happening. It's a framework. And what you have is, very interesting. You have a number of trends which I would say in most cases are going to be very positive and actually I think improve the security for the US and the security environment. But there's also this like you could say black or underside to it. And so the trends are, one thing is this rapid emergence of a middle class, this really rapid economic growth that may be a little bit tempered now going forward, but still unprecedented really in world history. And you have as part of that really this individual empowerment, which is part of this is women's role is really growing in the workplace all around the world. You have this collapse of the really gender gap in terms of education and health. That's all part of this issue. And it's going on not just in China or India where we hear, but actually in all regions of the world. At the same time, you also have, and this is part of that bigger story, is the access to technologies. And a lot of these technologies, the cyber ones, bio, and so on, which we see as secrets really to improvements in the world and have been on balance, are also ones that individuals can use for very lethal and very harmful purposes if they want to.
In specifics?
Well, obviously, I mean, the terrorism, we give an example in 2030 of you could actually think about terrorists who become cyber terrorists. I mean, that is, at this point, not something that the terrorists have actually begun to do in big ways, but we could see a lot of confluence of criminal networks with terrorists. Then you have this access to really not only doing very physical damage, but also bringing down infrastructures, doing a huge amount of disruption. Bio is also a huge issue. How you could be creating almost in your backyard very lethal diseases, man-made viruses, that have potential, huge potential for disruption. So you have this case of really a diffusion of power, so individuals having, in most cases, the ability to do far more good and really push along these improvements, or you have also their ability to really do violence on the level of a state. And that we haven't seen before. This makes it hugely difficult. Now you're having to track, individuals, small groups, just not state-sponsored terrorists, which was more what we were thinking, several decades ago. But now you're actually having to think about all these different possible threats.
The lone wolf problem.
Yes, and if you look in the, we publish every year, the DNI does an annual threat assessment every year. You'll notice if you go back 5-6 years that we don't talk as much about the individual, the lone wolf, but in the last year before that, much more about the lone wolf case. It makes it it's a much more complex security environment.
So the difference between seeing the Tsarnaev brothers, who could be seen as a lone wolf case, as opposed to people who went to Pakistan to train and then come back.
Yes, I mean, they can do this through the internet.
Right.
They can get the tools they need, but you could see this, the Tsarnaev case may be just the low level of what you actually could do in the future with a lot more very readily accessible technologies.
So let me branch out a little further and sort of go down the line and see what each of you believe is sort of the existential threat that you see out there in sort of the 2 or 3 top threats that you see out there existentially against the United States, and perhaps how the U.S. could respond to those. John, please.
Well, that's a tough question because there are so many issues on the table. Obviously, you don't have to list them for this very sophisticated audience, but if I were thinking about priorities, I would always approach it in terms of concentric circles, and I would draw circles and put the most important things at the innermost circle, and then circles out would contain issues of declining importance but still importance. So in that innermost circle, what do you put? To me, the calculus has always been, what are the things that threaten the lives of Americans, the physical security of our country, or our armed forces in combat? That has to always be kind of number one. So that takes you to things like terrorism. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. Weapons of mass destruction of all kinds, including intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons that can reach us. Cyber, which has been talked about a number of times before because of its potential to have an impact on all of our lives in so many ways. If you go the next circle out, sort of still on your issue of threats, now here it gets debatable, and everyone in the room will have their own way to do these circles. Next circle out, I'd probably put regional crises as major threats.
For example?
Well, for example, the Middle East right now, I can't imagine it. There's been no time in my lifetime when we've seen the level of turmoil and danger and unpredictability in the Middle East as we see now. Just the arc from, let's just start with Iran and move, that's not quite Middle East, but that whole arc from Iran across the Levant and across North Africa is in various states of turmoil. And pick out a couple of examples. Iran, probably before we meet again in this security forum, I mean, I'd say there's a 75 to 80% chance that issue will have come to a head. If you just look at Netanyahu's red line, he recently sort of clarified that to say, if they get to 250 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium, that's my red line. A little ambiguous about that, but that's how I read his comments. Well, my calculations, based on what I can see in the open source material, is the Iranians are only about 68 kilograms short of that red line now. They've got 140 some kilograms, and they've got 9,000 centrifuges they can operate at Natanz. That issue is going to come to a head in the midst of the greatest turmoil we've seen in the Middle East in our lifetimes. I'm sure we'll come back to that, but just to pause on another one, Syria, wouldn't surprise me if Syria were to break up as a result of what's going on there now. I had my students this year do papers on Syria, looking ahead to the question of what will a post-Assad Syria look like. And uniformly, the conclusion was, if Assad falls, we'll see more sectarian war there. That will go on. So, regional crises. Next circle out, I'd probably put big important countries that have uncertain futures. China, just pause briefly on them. China, for example, we could talk about in greater detail, but new leadership there, very different than the last leadership. I'd say China has the potential to surprise us in a lot of ways. For the first time in the period that I've been looking at China, I think there's at least a plausible chance of some instability there. That's not something I would have said 5 years ago. We can come back to that if you want. And Russia, we'll just leave aside for a moment, but a lot of issues there. Next circle out, I'd probably put countries that don't like us very much. North Korea would be there. They recently demonstrated the capacity to launch a missile and separate 3 stages to put a satellite in space, but that is in essence an ICBM capability. Perhaps without good guidance and all of the niceties that come with an ICBM as we know it, an intercontinental missile. But nonetheless, that's an advance over their last attempt to do this when they could only get 2 stages into space. That's very hard to do that with a missile. You got to get the stages to separate, they have to ignite at altitude, they have to not burn up, they have to achieve orbit, all of that. So there's that. And the next circle out, probably big trends that cut across all of these things. Technology, some of the things that Matt has written about in his 2030 paper, burgeoning population growth. If we look out over the next 30 years, the world will increase certainly by 2040 or 2050 to 10 billion people, and only 3% of that growth is projected to take place in the developed world. Now think about that for a minute. That means that we're going to have a lot of unemployed young people in megacities around the world, ripe for all kinds of recruitment by extremists. We'll come back to terrorism at some point, I'm sure. So if I were sort of listing the threats, that's, I think, how I would array them at this point.
So you'd still put terrorism as a first-order threat?
Well, I'd put it up in the first order. It may not be the number one, but in my judgment, there's an idea settling in, not always articulated in our country, but sort of settling in, that period in our history and in our history of conflict is coming to an end. The president didn't quite say that in his May speech, but if that was the takeaway for a lot of people. I'm thinking of what, having spent some time in the Cold War, what a Soviet personality, Leon Trotsky, many years ago, of course, long before I was at the CIA, is alleged to have said that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Changes in terrorism, I think we should be focusing on what's changing in terrorism, not whether there's an end point, not whether it's, what are the changes? I think they are so transformational as to compare plausibly with the transformational effect of the Berlin Wall coming down in the broader geopolitical sphere. So we're talking about the narrow sphere of terrorism. Let me just pick out 3 trends. First, the battlefield's changing. Now, we battled terrorism around the world, but the central arenas in our decade past have been Iraq and Afghanistan. And with our drawdowns and departure in Iraq, we're not going to have the same granular insight into those countries that we once did. Now, perhaps terrorists won't choose them to use them as operational bases, but it will be harder to know that. And Iraq itself is now subject to centrifugal forces that I could, again, make a plausible case that country could fall apart as well. Pair that up with Syria falling apart, and you're redrawing the lines in the Middle East. Second big trend. By the way, hearing myself talk reminds me of Bob Gates's definition of an intelligence officer. He said, that's someone who, when they smell flowers, they look for a coffin. So I'm not giving you just the dark side here, but
Smidgy negative, yeah.
But you know, it's the job of an intelligence person to think about the worst case, perhaps most often when others aren't. Second big trend in terrorism right now, I would say, is the changing pattern of governance in the area of greatest concern. You think about it, these countries which a few years ago were authoritarian countries, we didn't like that, but we liked the fact that they had visibility into their street and into their societies, and they had some control over them. Okay? That wasn't our values, but that was in some ways in our interests. Now, they've all turned over. And if you, again, look at that arc that I described before, I think you could make the case that there really are only two countries in that arc from Iran through Levant, and across North Africa that have real sovereignty, meaning control of their countries out to borders, and those two countries would be Iran and Israel. When you get past those two, we're talking about countries that have control mainly of their urban centers. You get outside those urban centers, you've got the world's largest ungoverned areas in the world. And so the bottom line there is, I think terrorists now have the largest area of safe haven and operational training that they've had in 10 years. And then the third trend, I'll stop here, is that they're learning. Remember, when you attack terrorists, it isn't like conventional war. You may destroy some of them, but you're not destroying tanks. You're changing them. They adjust, they adapt. They're learning that the harsh treatment that they mete out in areas where they hold sway doesn't go over with populations. You look at the documents picked up in Mali after the French left, picked up in safe houses of the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and they are in essence self-critiques of the fact that we've made a mess of this by treating the population so harshly, particularly women. We have to learn to treat people with care and provide services for them. That, by the way, is the Hezbollah model in Lebanon. And we're seeing that same pattern in Syria with Jabhat al-Nusra. We're seeing it in Yemen. We're seeing it in this group Ansar al-Sharia, which stretches across North Africa. And if they ever learn this lesson, that is, not to be so harsh where they hold sway, we'll have more trouble finding them and rooting them out in societies. So those three trends, I think, take us to a point in terrorism where we can't predict the end points, but we need to be humble about where this all migrates as a threat.
To push back just a little bit on the social services of AQAP in Yemen, they were very bad at this, and they ended up sort of taking over these areas, couldn't provide electricity, couldn't provide
Correct.
anything that the people wanted, so they brought the government officials back in and said, we're not good at this, you should be doing it instead. So they are learning the lesson, but it's taking them a long time. It's not like they're just going in like Hezbollah. And
no, it's taking them a long time, and some of this is very subtle. For example, in the case of Ansar al-Sharia, which is this small group that was one of the groups involved in the Benghazi attacks, and which is very strong in Tunisia and other parts of Libya. What they're telling their adherents is, don't head to the hills and go to militant training camps. Integrate into society. If you're a plumber, be a plumber. If you're a flower salesman, be a flower salesman. But adhere to our ideology, come to meetings, work with the population. I'm not saying this is a full-blown finished product yet, but it's a trend that we're picking up in a lot of these areas.
Okay, Charlie, what are your big scary threats?
Well, I'm known as being the warning officer who always warns of non-linear black swans, as we call them, or abrupt discontinuities. And I think the world is I love what Matt said and the 2030 trends. It's a great piece of work. They've done this before, the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, but this is the best. At the same time, there's going to be a lot, and you look at various options in the 2030 paper, and I think Matt masterminded that. I think they did a magnificent job. I'm not in the worst case side, but I certainly am not in the best case for where we'll be in 2030. When I was the NIO for warning and when I was an assistant DCI for collection, I focused on near term, what's going to happen in the next 6 months to a year. The next looking out 3 years was incredibly hard. We've been inevitably surprised with abrupt discontinuity. We were in 1973. I just spoke at the Richard Nixon Library bemoaning how bad our intelligence was and how poorly we performed. 1990, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. I did forecast that, but I couldn't find many people that would go along with the whole idea. 2 years before 9/11, I was holding daily meetings with the agency and the rest of the intelligence community on Al-Qaeda. We had people from every discipline. We were pressing hard, but we really did not do the job, and we had this kind of attack on the homeland. What I'm trying to say is that we're going to get things wrong, and I think John has comprehensively laid out the concentric circles. The erosion of the nation state is occurring, but we have that with the disruptive technologies that are incredibly positive. The internet is such a magnificent thing for good, but it's also a good for bad. And when you look at I think we're going to have a lot of regional instability particularly evolving around ethnic and religious conflict and terrorism, reaching all the way from Nouakchott all through the subcontinent over the next couple of years. I think we have today events that are evolving in Syria that are pretty amazing, with Hezbollah fighters coming in from the Bekaa Valley and serving as a surrogate proxy fighting force, doing a great job. You have, allegedly, if you believe the New York Times, there fighters coming in, intelligence types from Al-Quds in Iran. We have a perfect witch's brew evolving in Syria, which I think is going to explode out and affect the entire Levant and in ways that are detrimental to U.S. interests. John said our job was to protect U.S. people, and he's right. Our job is to keep the country safe, and that means U.S. interests broadly. We just had a major attack in Algeria back in February, which it attracted a bit of attention, but 37 hostages killed, 3 American, and we've sort of forgotten the threats that can evolve rather quickly. It was a rather complex planned attack by Mukhtar Bel-Mukhtar. He allegedly is dead now, but I think we'll see more of these discontinuities. And so first, I think the erosion of the nation state and this regional conflict, the spreading of the crisis of terrorism into West Africa, North Africa, and Al-Shabaab just recently conducting an attack last Saturday I guess down in Somalia, where they tried to attack a UN group where they claimed, guess what? They claimed they killed Americans. Well, that's totally false, patently false. But again, American interests, American life is very much at stake. And within the concentric circles, of course, my greatest worry of discontinuity has to do with WMD, with weapons of mass destruction, which we've had 3 administrations that's done a really good job of trying to control, working with allies and people not allies, control nuclear materials of all sorts. President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama. We've done a great job, but still we worry very much of loose materials, loose weapons, and given some of the trends in areas states that have nuclear weapons and where states that have enriched uranium that John talked about, this has to be extremely worrisome, and we should, as Americans, and give a lot of support to the intelligence community. The previous panel, the General Counsel of NSA, I thought defended very well the legitimacy and the correctness and the legality of what we have been doing, and has been the subject of such great concern. So those are great issues. John talked about East Asia and China. China, it's not an enemy. It's obviously a major trading partner. But we do have to get right the cyber issue with China, which has now been talked about publicly by the Director of National Intelligence and others. And we have to also take a correct, which I believe that Mark Welch talked about last night, the whole issue of defense modernization of China, all of which could lead to some real potential abrupt changes over time in the Pacific and Asia. We've been so focused on find, fix, and finish, we've lost our ability, I think, to do strategic assessment and warning. I think warning is, and warning in a digital age, when we move at wire speed, is a different world from the warning I did earlier. But I do believe we have to get away from the very tactical analysis and intelligence that we have done for the last several years. And if we do not do this, I think there will be other abrupt discontinuities, like the Arab Spring, where without going into any detail, I don't think the intelligence community really acquitted itself all that well. I think it could have done much better. John didn't mention this.
We'll talk about the tactical in just a second, and let me just, let's set the table here, and then we'll talk about how institutionally we can address some of these issues. There's a huge basket. We've already put lots of things in. Maurice, is there anything that we haven't mentioned that you would add to that? I'm sort of surprised nobody's mentioned Pakistan.
That's why I'm the last fixture here.
That's right, you're the cherry on the, yeah.
No, I associate myself with everything that's been said. However, I must tell you, I'm always skeptical about studies that tell me 30 years from now. With all due respect, I don't think the intelligence community got it quite right when they were not talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've had a study that Iran would not have the bomb for anywhere from 15 to 20 years. That was done by the DNI a few years ago. So I'd rather not look at predictions. Also, the question is, when you do those predictions, with the advent of metadata and what I would call machine data, what are you actually putting in there to get to the conclusion? That's my point on that. Now, I'm very pessimistic. I agree with my friend here. My greatest concern has always been weapons of mass destruction. We are heading into a period now where we have people who will have atomic weapons. Let's call it the rational ones. I would put China and Russia into that one. The Iranians and the Pakistanis, depending on how much political turmoil should arise, let's say in Pakistan, I don't consider them rational players in this, and I believe that we are heading for what I would call a climactic Armageddonic catastrophe. That's Armageddon changed a little. And that may come sooner, so that predictions of where the economy will be 30 years from now won't matter. All it will take is one of these dramatic attacks, if you will, whether it's nation, state, handoff, or whatever it is. And if I remember 20 years ago, I made a speech and a young man in the audience says, "What's the thing you fear most?" 20 years ago was nuclear attack. I think that that's the thing we have to worry about. That does not preclude radioactive bombs, biochem. The other part that I would go into is I am worried about our cyber capabilities in the future. I think that right now we're ahead of the game, but not for long. I mean, the Chinese have stolen billions of dollars of our technology, whether it's from our military, whether it's from private industry. I see no cessation of that, and I have no truck with people who say, oh, we should go to the UN and have a treaty on cyber. It'll never happen. And if anybody signed the treaty, like so many other treaties, they'd violate it. So my concern is that we are losing our edge here. That cyber aspect, and looking into the future, quantum. Now, we have supercomputers. Quantum is a way of being able to take encryption and bring it down to nanoseconds from days. Now, the first nation that gets that is going to have a tremendous advantage on us. And so all the studies on the other aspects, to me, these are the two areas. I have others, but for the purpose of the time here, These are my two areas I worry the most about.
Okay, let's talk a little bit institutionally and how in the future institutions in the United States will be able to respond to these kinds of threats. And let me just throw out one thing that is sort of a perennial thing we talk about here at the conference, which is the FBI and whether the FBI is still the best institution to handle terrorism cases. John, what do you think? Is the FBI the best institution? Should we go with an MI5 model? What do you think?
Well, handling terrorism, of course, involves a range of agencies, and the FBI has its role to play, and what it's emblematic of is that when 9/11 happened and in the subsequent years, that foreign domestic boundary disappeared, and except institutionally in the United States. And I think we've more or less fixed that with the reforms in the intelligence community over the last 10 years. So, going to your question, I personally would stick with an FBI model as opposed to an MI5 model. And part of my feeling about that is there are two parts to it. One is that the FBI over the last 10 to 12 years has made pretty dramatic progress in terms of its capacity to understand what's going on in the United States. I can say honestly, Bob Mueller, the retiring director, is someone who took over the agency just a week before 9/11. I remember meeting with him and the national security team at Camp David on September 15th as we tried to figure out what are the next steps. And Bob was at that point at the very front end of a transformation of the FBI, trying to understand it, and I think he's brought that off over the last 12 years that he's been the director. So my first point is the FBI has dramatically improved its ability to do what it has to do domestically. Second point is, if you were to try and create an MI5, I think we would have massive institutional chaos and societal controversy. Just listen to a couple of the earlier panels and imagine the headlines about a domestic spying service, which is essentially what the MI5 is in Great Britain, and it works well there. But I think for the United States to go in that direction would be just a step too far, a bridge too far, and too complicated in the circumstances I described a little earlier about the changing nature of terrorism and the need for us to kind of keep our gaze up and stay on the target.
I'd just like to add to what John said. I think, yes, the FBI has certainly centrality. It obviously has all the investigative responsibilities on intelligence. It has real responsibilities. But as John said, it's one of a number of players domestically. Yeah. DHS and its operating components, and it has a lot of data that's useful for countering either homegrown extremism or particularly inbound. So it's got to be, I'd like to see the new incoming director of the FBI to work harder to make it more open architecture on information sharing between DHS, other agencies like that fall under the DOJ, and obviously a greater deal of bottoms-up work with the police departments of this agency, the 17,000, the 850 sensors, and it's not just the police, it's the firemen, it's the sheriffs. We have not completed that architecture. And it's very difficult in our federal, state, and local system of government. But we can do better, and I look forward to the new director of the FBI continuing to work towards improvements, because as John Pistol, who's here in the audience, knows that TSA collects a lot of useful information that must be integrated broadly with the U.S. intelligence community and with law enforcement at the federal level.
Maurice,
Could I come back to a point? If I could
sure.
just come back to a point that
Okay.
Charlie stimulated. The answer to whatever problems we have remaining in counterterrorism, I don't think is institutional. Achieving further progress there, and this is where the Snowden case comes in as an impediment, achieving further progress there is a matter of data fusion. That's what it's about, data fusion. If a highway patrolman out here picks up someone who's suspicious and appears to be heading off to do evil deeds somewhere, and cannot tap into an FBI or CIA database that tells that patrolman what some CIA officer picked up in the back alleys of Cairo, then we've failed. And the urge you heard earlier today for perhaps greater compartmentation pulls in the other direction at a time when we have achieved pretty dramatic strides in data fusion. Now, one bad apple here may have set us back.
Let me ask a slightly different question, Maurice, and then you can wrap that into your answer. And that is, you know, there's been a lot of talk since Snowden about the possibility of resurrecting the idea of a national security court. Is that something that you think we should have here in the United States, a national security court that is focused on these sort of terrorism cases? Or, you know, should there be a tweak to the FISA court in the way it's structured now so that it's more transparent? Would we have these same problems if we had a national security court? Yes, Maurice.
Look, a number of the countries in the world have special courts that try terrorism. Let's take France. France, you have a magistrate and a judge, and all terrorism cases emanate out of Paris. Then the information is passed over to a regular, you can call it a federal court, but no juries. They'll allow juries in any other case, but not terrorism cases. England has a quasi aspect of that, so that there is some value to it. I mean, I think of the Moussaoui case. That was the 20th terrorist tried in Virginia. The judge, I believe, was Brinkema. That case went on for 4 years, am I right? Spent God knows how many millions of dollars. Moussaoui said, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. He brought his mother over to say, my boy is such a nice boy. Finally, he had fired 3 lawyers. Finally, he admitted he did it all. Now, here's a judge, and I'm sure she's a fine federal judge, but in my opinion, you've got to have people who are doing these cases, not necessarily the FISA court. The FISA court, that would be a conflict of interest if they're trying cases and issuing warrants to allow search and seizure. So I would say no, but I want to just get back to that other point.
Before you go to that other point, could I just say, so it's not lying out there, I'm not sure Moussaoui would be the example of how terrorism courts work in the United States. I think that's sort of the foul example of how they work.
Well, you're right.
I mean, the Abdul Muttalib case in Detroit, for example, the Detroit bomber was a pretty clean case, and that was not necessarily a judge who was steeped
well,
in
he
it like
settled.
Judge
I mean,
Kaplan
he didn't even have to go to a trial.
Right.
He
pled
took
out.
a plea.
He ended
That's
up
a lot
pleading out.
different from a
Right.
trial.
But it was very clean. So there are a lot of clean terrorism cases that aren't like Moussaoui.
And
But please
that's
go
my
ahead
view.
and make
Now,
your...
on one point that was made, and where were we that John had made? FBI.
FBI's right.
My FBI, I have a concern about that. The FBI is an institution that looks for evidence and then looks for prosecution. In the scope of promotions in their hierarchy, for example, putting an FBI agent into a foreign country like the CIA uses something called chiefs of station. That's their top intelligence officer in the various embassies. The legats, as they call the FBI people, generally, many of them, I remember a number of years ago, something like half of them had never even been out of the country. So what happens here is, if you're in the middle of a case trying to collect evidence, you do not want the evidence tainted. When you get into that legal aspect of it, I'm afraid that the FBI sometimes moves too far in the prosecutorial, and then they can go up to Congress and say, look at all the cases. The CIA, they can't tout their successes. They go along, do their business. Now, why would I want to see some other program? MI5. I rather like it, but I know politically it'd be very hard to have an MI5. MI5, in case you don't know it, has investigative powers, but no prosecutorial powers. They collect it, and the evidence goes over, then the English courts then take it over. Maybe there's some way of building a Chinese wall within the FBI where those FBI agents look solely at these terrorism cases, can never be involved in the prosecution, and perhaps in that way. And the last thing is cooperation. I come from New York City. New York City, I hate to tell you, if you listen to I won't say the names, but let's say our top law enforcement, meaning police people, the last thing in the world they'll tell you is how well the FBI cooperates with them. I've heard it not once, but a dozen times, except for one chief of counterterrorism in New York, who they all love, but the rest of it. Then the last part of that is something called fusion centers, which is Homeland Security and Joint Terrorism Task Force. One of the complaints you will hear about Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is the name implies, is collecting all these people together. It's not very useful in Homeland Security, and my own opinion is they ought to just close them up, save hundreds of millions of dollars, and they haven't been very good. However, the JTTF is good, but you'll get the complaint, well, the FBI dominates. They hold information or they don't give information. So that my concern is to get the FBI to work a little more, nothing totally negative about them, they're very good, but these are two areas where I'd like to see more work done.
So let's focus on an institution that everyone's been focused on recently because of the Snowden events, and that would be the FISA court. And a lot of people have talked about transparency in the FISA court. There are people within the intelligence community now who are trying to figure out ways to provide more information about the FISA court. So we have great brains of the intelligence community here. How could we possibly make a secret court less secret? What would be the transparency? And Matt, maybe you have some ideas on this too.
You know, I think it's, as we talked about this morning, I mean, I think this is something that you have to get Congress engaged in and have a discussion. I mean, if you want to build that legitimacy.
Can you still have, for example, could it be like the Fed, where they release minutes of the FISA court after a fashion?
No.
Why not?
No, I basically, I don't think you can make it much more
That'd get into sources and methods, and we can't compromise.
I don't think you can make it much more transparent, and I'll tell you why. We are already, you have to look at this comparatively. I mean, what the discussions we've had here today, extraordinary. You would not have them in any other country. You really wouldn't. We are already the most transparent country in the world when it comes to intelligence. Everything from our discussions of the FISA court, the DNI's annual testimony in Congress, which is seriously done and quite revealing. I've done it myself. Our oversight system. I believe our intelligence community is the most closely overseen institution in the US government, believe it or not. Our Congress, for example, gets more substantive product than any parliament in the world, to the extent that when we use material from another country, this is a bit off the subject, but it's the larger issue here of transparency. When we use material from another country, say Britain or let's just use Britain as an example, we have to be careful what we show our Congress, because in all likelihood their parliament hasn't seen that material. Now, I'm a big supporter of congressional oversight because it connects this arcane business of intelligence to the American people in some way. And I support all of this. All I'm saying is we are already very, very transparent. And an article I wrote in the foreignpolicy.com exactly a month ago yesterday, the way I concluded it was to make a prediction. And I'll make the prediction here, and you can tell me if you come to the forum next year and if I'm here, whether I'm right. My prediction was that the Snowden case and the FISA issue and all of that will stimulate a debate in our country where we will bring out every aspect of what we do and how we do it. And we've done a lot of that already here this morning. Mm-hmm. And at the end of that debate, the American public will understand in much greater detail and be much more comfortable with all of this, and that's all to the good. But we'll continue doing it. And we'll continue doing it perhaps under a modified legal regimen. And we'll be more comfortable with it and knowledgeable about it. But so will many people in the world who want to know this even more desperately than we do. Now, if you're the average citizen in our country, you might look at this and the thought bubble you have might be, that's all really kind of interesting, I'm glad to know it. If you're an intelligence officer, the thought bubble is, how hard do you want my job to be? Because this is a competitive game. This isn't patty cake intelligence. You're actually in a battle with people around the country, around the world, for knowledge. And those other folks, because of our superior power, one of their weapons is one we don't understand. This is the age of asymmetry. One of their asymmetric weapons to use with us is secrecy. If we can't find out about them, it helps to cancel out our superior power in many ways. And we have sort of given up on secrecy here.
Okay, I need to cut you
We
guys
really
off.
have, we
Just-
really have, Dina, and my view
I've stimulated all
is
these guys now. They're gonna-
extremely strong. I don't know what depth is required for the intelligence community, given where Jane Harman sat and the HIPSI, where she sat through not just hundreds, but thousands of briefings on the most sensitive activities that we did. And if they had to neck it down to just the chair or the ranking minority member, we did it. And the written responses, we give thousands of written responses to those oversight committees. And we also have to go to the appropriators. And I did that in both my role at CIA and at the DHS. There just wasn't much that, I can't think of much that we did not speak very candidly to in the Congress. And also to the PIAB. We used to talk, it was called the PIFIAB, then the PIAB. My goodness, we talked about sources, methods, accesses that if compromised could lead to real detriment to our national security overseas and to lives, to American lives, and also people who work for the United States to serve our national security interests. I don't know how much further we can go. And in this morning's discussion, I found quite disturbing, and I was very happy to see Ambassador Negroponte and Admiral Blair speak quite candidly on this.
One
Well,
interesting story.
let me just, I need to cut you off, I'm sorry, because we need to go to questions, and I don't want to, maybe you can wrap what you're going to say into one of the questions that happens here. So if you could raise your hands, and we'll get a microphone to you. We always start on that side of the room, so I'm going to keep doing that. So if you could get a microphone to the gentleman, and if you could please tell us who you are, and keep your question brief, because I went a little over time.
That I can do. I know most of the gentlemen up there. My name is John Kringen. I'm at the Institute for Defense Analysis. One topic that didn't come up, and I know it's always a tricky issue in the intel world, is I would say one of the big challenges from a national security point of view is economic and financial. I'd be interested in your views on how that plays in your views going forward.
Did I understand it correctly? Economic and financial issues?
Economic and financial issues, and frankly, lagging growth, financial instability, how that all plays out over the next couple decades.
I think we did mention that, actually. I can't remember who talked about financial.
Matt spoke about it earlier, but it's going to have great effect. We still have globally 1.1 billion people in extreme poverty. The 2030, one of the new worlds of 2030, according to the Nick paper, is a little bit of optimism about a rising middle class. But the economics is going to, I think, and the regional instability that I referred to, with all the way through the Middle East and South Asia and much of Africa, where that we're going to have continuing instability and the lack of real economic growth and the lack of investment. And the world economy is, as you know, the developed world economy is grinding slowly. I thought John spoke very well about some concerns over China and over its future, and
Let's give
it's
Matt
not
a
so
chance
great.
here. Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
One of the things, I mean, I think this is critical, and as you know, John, I mean, it's an area that we need to do, I think, better in the intelligence community. And I would say that the interesting thing where you get the instability is with the rising expectations, which comes with more growth. I mean, Egypt had very good growth before the Arab Spring. And this is in part because you are rising expectations, but you got to have a huge population of youth who really want those jobs, see that the rest of the world is living much better. And that's the sort of, I mean, it's counterintuitive at times. You'd think that growth would actually enhance stability. It doesn't in a lot of these cases. And that's actually how we need to think about this a lot more, how that plays in.
I could add a point. There's a 17-year period from 1991 to 2008 that's very important as we look at the kind of Cold War era. That's the period between the fall of the Soviet Union and the 2008 financial crisis. In that period of time, the United States pretty much had free rein to do what it wanted to do in the world. Whether it did it well or not is another question. The financial crisis really put a dent in our power and influence in the world, and that's, I think, the main thing I take from it, that without getting our own house in order here, it affects American power. The last time I was in China, I asked a vice minister of the Communist Party, what's your major national security concern? And without any hesitation, she said, internal development. So that's how they're thinking, and their manufacturing is growing 14% year over year. Matt has in his report the figures at the point at which China will become the largest economy in the world. So it's a competitive game, and it affects everything. We talked about sequestration earlier. Obviously, that's the result of all this.
Again, China's growth may be the way John predicts it. But if you talk to Joe Nye and others, it's not going to be linear. There could be, again, the discontinuity. And that will affect the world if China begins to weaken and stumble for a variety of reasons that we could talk about at length economically. That's very crucial. And John, you're right. CIA and others do not do enough good analysis strategically on the economic outlook. I'm glad the Nick paper highlighted it, and I think it's a subject of great discussion.
Okay, this gentleman in the blue shirt, Bob Rosencrantz.
Bob Rosencrantz, Intelligence Squared Debates. I'd like to bring the conversation one step back from terrorism, which in my view is simply a tactic that radical Islam uses to get its way in the world. And I wonder if you could comment on the threat that radical Islamists wind up in control of the oil resources of the Gulf, or wind up in control of the nuclear weapons in Pakistan, and both assess those risks and outline some of the things we might do to mitigate them.
Well, it's a great question. The current leader of Al-Qaeda, Zawahiri, has always had in mind, and I'll go beyond terrorism per se, has always had in mind the need for that movement, radical Islam, to have some territory, some ground that it owns or can marginally control. And wherever he's hiding right now, he's probably looking at Syria and saying, this is my dream come true, because probably one part of Syria is going to end up in hands of people like that. And ties are growing between them and Islamic radicals in Western Sahara, or Western Iraq. And just to stay with Syria for a moment, as far as we know, they don't have nuclear weapons, but they do have other kinds of WMD material. I personally don't know where it is. Perhaps someone in our intelligence community does. But if there is continued sectarian war in Syria, the biggest question will be, particularly if that country kind of breaks up into cantonments, where is that stuff? Who's got their hands on it? What are they doing with it? I mean, that's just one example of what you have to worry about. I don't worry about Pakistan in quite that same way, but of course they have 100 nuclear weapons and all of that, but I do worry about Pakistan, but it's at this point not at the point of dissolving or breaking up.
Matt, could you just, let me just get Matt in here.
Well, there are a couple with, one issue that we haven't really talked about, but in other settings is all they want to talk about, which is shale oil and gas. So totally different energy picture happening really overnight. Within 5 years, the U.S. can be a producer getting up to the scale of a Middle East one. And you have, an issue here of where the price of oil is going to be in the future. And a lot of these countries, including Saudi Arabia, rely on a higher and higher price really to balance their budget. And a lot of that budget is going into social welfare programs. So you could see, as a result of these other, trend lines coming in, increased stability. And Equally, if you look at Pakistan, the big issue, and John mentioned this, is population. This country is going to have 30 to 40% more population in a 15, 20-year period. No country can handle that. So those are the, that puts huge stresses on governance in both cases. And I think, when you're looking at that arc of instability, a lot of the thing comes down to governance. And that's the most difficult thing for an outside actor like the US to help with, but it's also probably the most critical factor between stability and instability.
Okay, let me go to Kim Dozier here in front. Wait for the microphone. Thanks.
Thanks. I have a question again for Matt Burrows. You might not like the question. I've been to a few of your presentations where you have these amazing, here's what's going to happen in several decades. How reactive have you found the White House, branches of federal government, to what you tell them? Have you been able to point to something saying they're listening and changing what they're doing because of what we found out?
Yes, is the answer. In this present volume, the interesting thing was that they wanted to engage very early, much before the publication. And one of the big issues was on the energy, looking at that, looking at the implications of that. That is still something ongoing in terms of how to think about a policy, but certainly getting the information, some of the preliminary analysis on what the impacts. I'd point to in previous administrations and previous works, the Secretary of State Clinton had a initiative on water, on food. There's an enormous amount of stuff that we've been writing in Global Trends, also in some of our other, these are open publications that the NIC has done on those issues. And some of those were directly a result of the kind of analysis that we were producing. So there is impact. This is a moving target, and I take Maurice's point on this. That, if you go back, we were just talking about shale 5 years ago. That's not something that we featured a lot in our analysis, nor is it something that actually the majors did, because they weren't in the shale gas and oil business. But it's something, why you do this, continually update it, is to try to get policymakers, and they do this, I think, increasingly better at it, thinking about different scenarios and how things could happen. That 9/11 was probably a real wake-up call for policymakers beginning to think about these very untoward events happening.
Could I just add to that, I've watched this over many years and was involved in the very first one in 1995. Our government's gradually figured out that these aren't point predictions. Not going to tell you precisely what's going to happen in Egypt 3 years from now. But the little trend assessments that come about, largely through outside experts, are quite enlightening. Back in 1995, for example, I remember just one of the things we said was, the world will be revolutionized in not very long by universal handheld communication. Whoa, hadn't that just happened? And the things that we said about population, I'm talking about population now for all these years, the key conclusion was we're going to see more and more intra-societal conflict, more or less what's happened. Doesn't allow our government to take specific actions, not actionable intelligence. But if they're thinking strategically, these papers are a big help.
Okay, Mr. Quigley there. Wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you, gentlemen. Michael Quigley with Human Rights First. As a former intelligence officer, I know that intelligence officers do look for risk and predict the worst case scenarios, but we also look for opportunity. And my concern about cabining the counterterrorism efforts in law of war and AUMF and so forth, focusing on the find, fix, finish, we are giving short shrift to the long-term counterterrorism opportunities of non-kinetic. And I want to know what are your views on how we can develop that and how we can move away from the reliance on the kinetic so we can do it less over time and do more with the non-kinetic long-term, encouraging the moderate voices in Islam?
It's a great question. I'm going to tell you, it fits what most of us have thought about as sort of the classic formula for dealing with terrorism. And we've done reasonably well on 2/3 of it and not well on 1/3 of it. So I mean, the classic formula most of us think about is to destroy terrorism, you got to do three things. You got to destroy the leadership, you have to deny it safe haven, and you have to change the conditions that give rise to the phenomenon. Okay, we've done pretty well on destroying leadership. For a while we were doing well on safe haven, but as I suggested in my first comments, I think they're getting their safe havens back. The third thing we have not done well on at all, changing the conditions. In other words, this comes about for reasons that are discernible. A lot of it is in Matt's report. What's happening in the world, the conditions that give rise to this phenomenon. The only way you can attack that is not through kinetic means or through even intelligence sources. You got to attack that through a combination of assistance policies, strategic communication, which we've more or less neglected in our country for many years, NGO work coordinated with U.S. aid policies to the extent that's possible, and working with local governments on health issues and issues of education. None of this is easy, and that's probably why we haven't done much of it. But that's my answer.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, and I apologize for not getting to all of your questions, but the gentlemen will be here during the week, and you might be able to ask them themselves. Please give them a hand. Thank you very much.